When my father took me in the dead of night to the club, he whispered in my ear, "Now you're going to pay my debt." I was 12 years old and became the currency for his lost bets. For 5 years, I paid with my body for every card he played wrong. "Now you're going to pay my debt." That's what my father said to me the first time he took me to that cursed place. Hi there, my dear ones. How are you all doing? I hope you're well, healthy, and with peace in your hearts, which is what matters most in this life. My name is Eliza May Carson. I'm 79 years old and still going strong. I was born and raised here in Millbrook, in our beloved Mississippi, land of sweet tea and the best fried chicken you'll ever taste. I live in Jackson now, but my heart is always here in Millbrook, this blessed little town that saw me born and where I lived the most significant experiences of my life. You know what I do every morning? I wake up early, at 5:30 in the morning, and tend to my garden in the backyard. That, my children, is my moment of peace. I grow basil, chives, bell peppers, cherry tomatoes. Everything organic, just the way my mama taught me. I started this garden about 15 years ago, after my husband passed. May God rest his soul. At first, it was just to occupy my mind, you know, to keep from dwelling on the bad things in life. But today, my goodness, it's become my passion. I even sell some vegetables to the neighbors here on the street. I'm here in my cozy kitchen, sitting at the little table where I have my coffee every afternoon. From here, I can see my garden through the window, and the smell of the herbs comes right in. It's a perfume of peace, you know? Next to it is my favorite armchair, where I do my knitting and where I receive my grandchildren when they come visit on weekends. Look, before I continue telling my story, I want to make a special request from the bottom of my heart. If this video is reaching you, if you're hearing this grandma's voice here, it's because there's something we need to share. Isn't that right? So don't forget to leave that like button down there. It really helps this grandma continue sharing her memories. And subscribe to Grandparents' Tales too, okay? Hit that bell so you don't miss any story. And you, my dear ones watching me now, tell me here in the comments, from which corner of the United States are you watching me? And what time of day did you find this video? In the morning with your hot coffee, after lunch in the shade, or in the evening when the sun is setting? I always read all the comments with great affection and get emotional knowing where you're from and when you take time out of your day to listen to this grandma's memories from Millbrook. Tell me, will you? Let's make a chain of love that crosses this country from coast to coast. You know, my children, there are stories in our lives that take a very long time to tell. Stories that hurt so much we'd rather keep them deep in our chests, afraid they'll hurt even more when they come out of our mouths. But the time has come to share with you a memory I've carried for over 60 years. A memory that began when I was just a little girl of 12, right here in Millbrook. It was a time when things were very different from today. Families were closed off. Fathers commanded and children obeyed without asking questions, especially girls, who had to always be good, always quiet, always obedient. And it was precisely this obedience that almost destroyed me. But I'll tell this story slowly, the way it happened, because I know there are many people out there who need to hear that it's possible to come out of the deepest hole and see the sun again. That it's possible, yes, to transform pain into strength and shame into courage. Because that's what I learned over these 79 years of life. That there's no night so dark that doesn't have its dawn. So take a deep breath with me, my dear ones, and let's together remember the old days when Millbrook was even smaller, when houses were simpler, and when a girl named Eliza still played with dolls without knowing that life was going to teach her very hard lessons. Let me tell you about my family when I was little, back in the 1950s here in Millbrook. My father's name was Otto Carson, a tall man, dark-haired, always very well dressed, and with that way about him that showed he knew how to talk to everyone. On the street, everyone knew Otto. "Hey, Otto," friends would shout when he passed by. He was one of those men who never let a party go by, always lively, always laughing loud, always at the center of conversation circles. My mother, God rest her soul, was named Sarah. Everyone called her Sally. She was a frail woman one of those who seem like they'll break if the wind blows too hard. She always had her hair pulled back in a tight bun and dark circles under her eyes that never left her face. For as long as I can remember, my mother complained of headaches and what she called nerves. The doctor always prescribed medicines that came in brown bottles, and she took them religiously every night before bed. There were just the three of us at home. I was an only child, a rare thing back then when families usually had 5, 6 children. Sometimes I'd hear the neighbors whispering, "Poor Sally, she only managed to have one daughter." Today, I understand that maybe it was a blessing from God that I didn't have siblings, given what happened later. Our house was on Magnolia Street, right in the center of town. It was a simple little house with a door and window painted light blue with a small porch in front where my mother used to sit to do sewing in the late afternoon. It had 2 small bedrooms, a living room that also served as a kitchen, and a small backyard where my mother raised some chickens and planted her herbs. I inherited my love of gardening from her. My parents' bedroom was at the front of the house, and mine was right behind it, separated only by a thin brick wall. At night, I heard everything, the conversations, the fights, and especially my mother's snoring after she took her medicines. Those medicines were really strong. My mother slept like a rock, and not even thunder could wake her. During the day, our routine was pretty simple. I'd wake up early, have my coffee with milk and buttered toast, and go out to play with the girls from the street. Back then, Millbrook was very small, everyone knew each other, and children played freely in the street without danger. We played Ring Around the Rosy hide-and-seek house. I had a rag doll my mother had made, all colorful patches. That was my favorite. My father worked at a fabric store downtown, but he always came home with stories about where he'd been. Stopped by Joe's bar for a beer. Went to Buddy Joaquin's house to handle some business. There was a dance at Mrs. Miller's and I just dropped by. It was always a different excuse for coming home late. Saturday afternoons were the ones that most marked my childhood. While my mother rested, the medicines made her drowsy even during the day, my father would take me for walks around downtown. We'd go to the farmer's market, where he'd buy me candy and honey from the local beekeepers. Then we'd stop by the social club, where he always just dropped in to say hello to friends. This club was the meeting point for the town's important men. It was in an old mansion, painted yellow, with tall windows and a large porch in front. From the outside, it looked like a normal house, but inside it had several small rooms, a large hall with a stage, and some little rooms in the back that I never knew what they were for. The smell there was always the same: cigarette smoke mixed with cheap perfume and a sour smell of old whiskey. I'd wait for my father on the porch, playing alone while he handled some business inside. Sometimes it took a long time and I'd get bored, listening to the murmur of men's voices, loud laughter, and a strange sound like chips hitting the table. When I asked what that noise was, my father always said, "It's just the fellas playing cards, sweetie." Around age 10, I started noticing that my father was different after these drop-ins at the club. Sometimes he'd come home happy, humming, buying me sweets. Other times he'd come back quiet, scowling, and I knew it was better not to make noise. At those times, he'd look at me in a way that gave me a chill, as if he were thinking about something I couldn't understand. My mother always asked where we'd been, but my father answered quickly. We went to the market and took a walk. And that was it. She never insisted, never asked more questions. The medicines left her kind of out of it, without much energy to question anything. That's how our life was in Millbrook in those days. My father always going out, always handling business, always in a hurry. My mother always tired, always taking medicines, always sleeping early. And me in the middle, a girl who just wanted to play and be happy, without suspecting anything of what was to come. The other families on our street seemed happier, more united. I saw neighbors eating dinner together, talking on the porch, parents playing with their children. In our house, the silence always weighed too heavily, as if everyone was keeping some secret that couldn't be spoken. And that's how I spent my childhood, between walks with my father to the mysterious club and quiet afternoons beside my drowsy mother, never imagining that when I turned 12, those business dealings my father handled would turn into the most terrible thing a girl could experience. It was on a Tuesday in March 1958 that everything changed in my life. I remember it like it was yesterday because it was the day after my 12th birthday. My mother had made a coconut cake, my favorite, and I was still happy playing with the new doll I'd received. That night my father came home different. It wasn't that difference from when he lost at gambling and was scowling. It was something new, an anxiety in the way he paced back and forth in the living room, smoking cigarette after cigarette. He'd look at me, then look at the bedroom where my mother was already snoring heavily. She'd taken her medicines earlier that day, complaining of a terrible headache. "Eliza," he called me softly, "come here for a minute." I was in my little room, combing my new doll's hair, all focused on playing. When I heard my father call me that way, with that different voice, I felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. "What is it, Daddy?" "Sit here next to Daddy. I need to talk to you about something important." I sat on the edge of the chair next to him. The smell of cigarettes was stronger than normal, mixed with a sour smell of liquor I already knew well. He ran his hand through my hair, but the affection felt strange, different. "My daughter," he began, and his voice was kind of shaky. "You're a young lady now, right? 12 years old. You're not a little child anymore." I nodded, yes, not really understanding where he was going with this. "Look, Eliza, Daddy's going through some difficulties, some debts that are pending, some commitments I need to settle urgently, and sometimes, when we're really family, we have to help each other. Understand?" Those words echoed in my head without much meaning. Debts? Commitments? I was just a girl. How could I help with grown-up things? "Daddy, I don't understand." "You'll understand, sweetheart. Tonight, when your mother is sleeping soundly, I'm going to need you to come with me to handle some important business. It's family stuff, serious stuff, and you, as my daughter, need to help me." The way he spoke gave me chills. Something was wrong, but I couldn't understand what. I just knew I didn't want to leave the house in the middle of the night, didn't want to leave my warm little room, didn't want to get involved in grown-up business. "But Daddy, what if Mama wakes up and doesn't find me?" "Your mother won't wake up. You know how heavily she sleeps with the medicines. We'll be back quickly, and she won't even notice we left." I spent the rest of the night with a knot in my stomach, lying in my bed, listening to my father's footsteps in the living room, the creaking of the chair where he sat smoking. Around 2 a.m, when my mother's snoring was at its loudest, he came to get me. "Let's go, Eliza. It's time." I got up half asleep, half scared. He helped me put on a simple dress and led me by the hand to the living room. The house was dark, only lit by the streetlight coming through the front window. "Listen carefully, my daughter," he said, holding my face with both hands. "What we're going to do today is our secret. You can't tell anyone, especially your mother. If you tell, it'll cause a huge mess, and the one who'll suffer is her. Understand?" I nodded, yes, even though I didn't understand anything. I just knew I didn't want my mother to suffer. We left through the front door. The street was deserted. You could only hear the sound of our footsteps on the pavement. Millbrook in the dead of night was a ghost town, with all the houses closed and a silence that hung in the air. We walked downtown, and I soon recognized the way. We were going to the social club. But this time was different. Instead of entering through the front door, where there were always people talking and laughing, my father took me down a side alley to a small door at the back of the building. He knocked 3 times, paused, and knocked 2 more times. It seemed like a password. The door opened, and a man I didn't know appeared. He was fat, sweaty, with an open shirt and a strong smell of sweat mixed with liquor. "Hey, Otto, you came at a good time. The folks are already waiting." "Brought her as agreed," my father replied, and for the first time in my life, I heard fear in his voice. The man looked me up and down, and I wanted to hide behind my father. But he gently pushed me forward. Go on, sweetheart. Go in, and Daddy will be right behind you. The place was completely different from the part of the club I knew. It was darker, with weak light bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and the smell was horrible. Old cigarettes, spilled liquor, and something sour I'd never smelled before. There were several doors along a narrow hallway, and from some came the sound of muffled voices and strange laughter. My father took me to one of the doors and opened it. It was a small room with just a bed, a chair, and a small table. The window was closed with a heavy curtain, and the only light came from a weak bulb on the ceiling. "Sit there on the bed and wait for Daddy to come back," he said, and his voice was different, harder. "And remember what I said. This is our secret." "Daddy, I'm scared." "You don't need to be scared of anything. They're just some of Daddy's friends who are going to talk to you. Good people, people you know from the street." And then he said those words that were burned into my soul like a branding iron. "Come on, daughter. Daddy had a bad night at cards. I need you to help me settle the debts. Now you're going to pay my debt." He left the room and closed the door. I heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. I was alone in that strange place, sitting on the edge of a bed that smelled of mold, with my heart beating so hard it felt like it would come out of my mouth. It didn't take long for the door to open again, but it wasn't my father. It was Mr. Ribeiro, who owned the pharmacy where my mother bought her medicines. A man who always gave me candy when I stopped by the store with her, who always asked how I was doing in school, who had always been kind to me. But that night, in the dark little room at the back of the club, Mr. Ribeiro wasn't being kind. He was different, with his eyes shining in a strange way, and the little smell of medicine he always had was mixed with the smell of whiskey. "Hi there, little Eliza," he said, closing the door behind him. "Your father said you were going to help me with some of his little problems." And that's how the nightmare that would last 5 years of my life began. That night, in that stinking little room, I learned what it meant to be currency. I learned that girls like me had no value of our own. We only served to pay off the debts our fathers made playing cards and dice. When it was all over, hours later, my father came to get me. I was sitting on the floor of the room, hugging my own knees, unable to look anywhere. He helped me up and took me back home, walking through the still dark streets of Millbrook. "Remember," he whispered in my ear before putting me to bed, "this is our secret. If you tell anyone, your mother will die of shame and sadness." I lay in my bed, pulled the sheet up to my neck, and pretended I was sleeping when my mother woke up in the morning. But sleep was never the same again. The girl who played with dolls had died that night, and in her place a child had been born who carried on her shoulders the weight of her father's sins. What happened that first night wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a cursed routine that would repeat itself 2-3 times a week for the next 5 years of my life. My father had discovered a cruel way to settle his gambling debts, and I became the permanent guarantee for his mistakes at cards and dice. The nights always followed the same macabre ritual. My father would wait for my mother to take her medicines and start snoring heavily. That loud snore that echoed through the whole house, mixed with the sound of crickets in the yard. Then he'd come to my room, always with that nervous manner, smoking more than normal, his hands trembling slightly, and whisper the words that froze my blood. "Let's go, Eliza. I have debts to settle." I learned to recognize the signs. When he came home later than normal, when he paced the living room like a caged animal, when the smell of liquor on him was stronger than the cigarettes, I already knew that night would be one of my nights. It got to the point where I'd lie in bed, all tense, waiting for his footsteps in the hallway. The path to the club became too familiar. I knew every loose paving stone, every streetlight that flickered when the wind shook the wires, every dark shadow of the closed houses. I knew that at Mr. Johnson's house there was always a light on in the kitchen, that Mrs. Lewis's dog always barked softly when we passed, that Mr. Peterson's gate creaked when the wind blew. And the worst part was that during the day, when I walked these same streets with my mother to shop or go to church, I'd see those places and remember all the early mornings I'd passed through there being taken like a package for delivery. Every corner was a memory, Every street was a nightmare disguised as normalcy. At the club, the ritual was always the same too. The password at the back door, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, that I already knew by heart. The fat man who opened it already knew why we were there, always with that disgusting smile and eyes shining with malice. The smelly hallway with those mysterious doors, each hiding stories I didn't even want to imagine. And that smell. That cursed smell of old cigarettes, sour liquor, and something rotten I could never identify, but that stuck to my clothes and hair. But what hurt me most weren't the stinking rooms where I was left. It was what my father always said before abandoning me there, always with that voice that tried to be affectionate but sounded false. Stay quiet and do everything the uncles tell you. Remember, you're saving our family. If you don't help Daddy, we'll lose the house and your mother will die of grief. You don't want that, do you, sweetheart? And then he'd leave, leaving me alone, waiting for the uncles, men I knew very well from normal town life. Mr. Ribeiro from the pharmacy always came back, sometimes alone, sometimes bringing other people. There was Dr. Carver, who was a lawyer and lived in a big house near the church, always in a pressed suit and talking fancy. There was Mr. Mitchell, who had a general store at the farmer's market and always gave me lollipops when I went with my mother to shop. There was even Professor Andrews, who taught at the elementary school where I studied and whom everyone respected as an educated and cultured man. The most terrible thing was encountering these men during the day and having to pretend everything was normal. When Mr. Ribeiro gave me candy at the pharmacy, smiling and asking how I was, I felt nausea rising in my throat. When Professor Andrews called on me to answer questions in class, I'd freeze, the words would come out jumbled, and he'd get impatient, thinking I was stupid. When Dr. Carver greeted my mother on the street, tipping his hat and making bows, I wanted to scream, wanted to tell everyone who he really was, but the words got stuck in my throat, as if they'd sewn my mouth shut. There was one time when Mr. Mitchell was weighing beans for my mother at the market and gave me a banana, like he always did with children. When I reached out to take it, he held my hand a little longer than normal and winked at me. My mother didn't see, she was distracted choosing tomatoes, but I felt that disgusting shiver going up my spine. It was as if he was reminding me of our agreement, of the secret we shared. My life became a play where I had to play 2 completely different roles. During the day, I was little Eliza, good girl, obedient daughter, quiet student. In the dead of night, I became the thing my father used to pay his debts. It was as if I were 2 different people living in the same body, and neither could be happy. At school, my grades plummeted like a rock thrown in the river. I, who had always been a good student, suddenly was getting bad grades in everything. The teacher, Mrs. Carmen, called my mother to talk, worried because I was always drowsy, always distracted, always in another world. "The girl seems like she's on another planet," she told my mother, adjusting her glasses and leafing through my notebook full of incomplete exercises. Could she be sick, or has something happened at home? How was I going to explain to Mrs. Carmen that I couldn't pay attention to math lessons because I was counting how many men had been through that stinking room that week? How was I going to tell her that I couldn't concentrate on multiplication tables because my head was always at the club, always in those dark hallways, always on those voices whispering things I wanted to forget? My mother, poor thing, thought I was getting nervous like her. She started giving me chamomile tea before bed, thinking it would calm me down, doing those folk remedies her grandmother had taught her. If she only knew the problem wasn't nerves, but what happened after she passed out from the medicines. If she only knew her little daughter was being used as currency to pay her husband's lost bets. The worst were Sundays at church. My family always sat on the same pew, right in front, because my father liked to show he was a God-fearing man and that his family was upright. I'd be there, wearing my prettiest dress with my hair combed by my mother, listening to the preacher talk about sin and purity, about the importance of chastity and obedience to parents. And I felt like all those words were directed at me, like poisoned arrows in my heart. It was as if I were the sinner, as if I were the dirty one, as if I had chosen that life. The preacher said, God saw everything and knew all our actions, and I was terrified, thinking he was judging me, that he thought I was a bad girl for not having the courage to tell what was happening. Once, when I was about 13, I tried to talk to the teacher, Mrs. Carmen. I approached her desk after class, when all the other students had run out to recess, and started stuttering something about a secret that was hurting me. The words came out confused, mixed with tears I was trying to swallow. Mrs. Carmen, I began, nervously fidgeting with the hem of my uniform. There's something that I wanted to tell you. But before I could form a complete sentence, she interrupted me, looking at her watch and gathering her books. Eliza, if you're having problems at home, talk to your parents. Teachers don't get involved in family matters. This is something to resolve at home. I tried once more with Mrs. Fitzgerald, our neighbor, an elderly lady who'd always been kind to me and sometimes gave me fudge when I passed by her house. She was sweeping the yard when I found her, and I started beating around the bush, trying to find courage to open my heart. But in the middle of the conversation, when I was gathering courage to tell her there were some uncles who did bad things to me, she stopped sweeping and looked at me with a strange expression. Girl, be careful with those conversations. There are certain things that it's better not to go around talking about, especially about important men in town. That could cause trouble for your family. Your mother doesn't need more problems, does she? It was as if she knew something, as if everyone in town knew but pretended they didn't see. As if I were the only one who didn't understand that this was part of life, that it was just the way things were, that girls like me served this purpose. It was as if there was a silent conspiracy, a tacit agreement that certain things shouldn't be talked about. At 14, my body started changing, and the uncle's comments became different, more disgusting. They talked as if I were cattle at market, comparing, evaluating, deciding who would take advantage first. They made bets among themselves about my body, laughed about things I didn't even understand. I wanted to disappear, wanted to turn to smoke and vanish from that cursed place, wanted to never again have to hear those voices and feel those stares. What hurt me most was watching my mother wither like a plant without water. The medicines increased. Now she was taking 3 different bottles every night. The headaches became more frequent, and she started talking to herself sometimes, murmuring prayers or talking to people who weren't there. I was sure she suspected something, but it was as if she was afraid to discover the truth, as if she knew she wouldn't be able to bear whatever was happening. One night, when I was 15, I came home after another session at the club and found my mother awake in the kitchen. It was almost 4 a.m, and she was sitting at the table, still in her nightgown, with red eyes from crying and trembling hands. "My daughter," she said in a choked voice, without even raising her eyes to look at me. "I know there's something very wrong happening in this house. I don't know what it is, but I know there is." A mother's heart feels when there's something bad nearby. My heart raced, like it would burst out of my mouth. For a moment, I thought about telling everything, about throwing myself in her arms and asking for help, about screaming that I couldn't take it anymore, that I wanted it to end. But then I remembered my father's words, always hammering in my head. "If you tell, your mother will die of grief. Her heart can't take it. You'll be responsible for your own mother's death." Looking at that frail woman, already so destroyed by medicines and suspicions, with disheveled hair and trembling hands, I was certain she really couldn't handle knowing the truth. That knowing what her husband was doing with their only daughter would finish destroying what little remained of her sanity. So I lied, once again. "There's nothing wrong, Mama. You're imagining things because of the medicines. Must be nightmares." She looked at me for a long time, and I saw in her eyes that she knew I was lying. But she didn't insist, didn't ask more questions. She got up from the table slowly, as if carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, gave me a kiss on the forehead with cold lips, and whispered, "May God protect us, my daughter. May God have mercy on us all and protect us from evil." and that's how I continued carrying alone the burden that was destroying my entire family. My father sinking deeper and deeper into gambling, coming home later and later and more desperate. My mother slowly killing herself with medicines to avoid seeing reality, every day thinner and more faded. And me in the middle, being the price everyone paid for a false peace, being the rotten glue that kept that sick family functioning. At 16, I was no longer a child. I was a broken, tired adolescent, without dreams, without hope. I'd stopped playing, stopped laughing, stopped believing life could be different. Each early morning I spent at that club was like dying a little more, as if they were tearing pieces of my soul and throwing them in the trash. But fate was preparing a turn of events that none of us expected. At 17, I was already resigned to my fate. 5 years of nights at the club had molded me into a different person, older, more tired, more dead inside than any teenager should be. I had accepted that this would be my life forever. By day, pretending to be a normal girl from a good family, by night, being my father's currency. I'd even stopped dreaming of a different future, because dreaming hurt too much when reality always came back in the following early mornings. Until one Friday in September 1963, everything changed. It was one of those rare nights when my father came home humming an old tune. I recognized the signal immediately. He'd won something at cards, and won big. When that happened, which wasn't often, he'd be euphoric, generous, even affectionate with the family, as if luck at cards could temporarily erase the guilt of what he did to me. He'd buy me sweets and better medicines for my mother, bring flowers from the market, even help with household chores, as if he wanted to redeem himself for the weeks of torture he put us through. "Eliza!" he shouted from the door, waking my mother, who had already taken her 3 bottles of medicine and was starting to snore. "Come here, sweetheart. Daddy has a surprise for you." I came out of my room barefoot in my nightgown, suspicious. My father's surprises were never really good. They always came with some hidden price I'd end up paying later. There was always a second intention behind moments of kindness. He was in the living room, with a bottle of whiskey almost empty on the table and a wide smile on his flushed face. In his wrinkled linen pants pockets, there was the sound of money, coins and crumpled bills he kept counting and recounting with trembling fingers of anxiety and alcohol. "Look what Daddy won today," he said, showing a handful of large bills, more money than I'd ever seen together in my life. "Got lucky at cards, won from Colonel Menezes in one hand, a royal flush that came from heaven." Colonel Menezes was one of the richest and most powerful men in the entire region, owner of 3 huge farms and hundreds of head of cattle, an important person everyone respected and feared at the same time. He was the type of man who decided who got jobs in town, who received favors from City Hall, who prospered, and who got screwed. If my father had won money from him at a card table, it had been quite a victory, the kind of thing that becomes legend in a small town. "Tomorrow's Saturday, and you won't need to. You won't have to go anywhere with me," he said, and I understood perfectly he was talking about the club. "You can rest, Daddy's square with everyone, all debts paid." For a fleeting moment, I felt a tiny bit of hope sprouting in my chest like a stubborn little flower. Maybe things would really change this time. Maybe my father had finally learned to win instead of just losing. Maybe that big luck was the beginning of a new life, where I could go back to being a normal girl, go to school without being sleepy, play with friends, even date a nice boy when the time came. But knowing my father as I did, part of me already knew that joy would be short-lived. His luck always turned, and it did. On Saturday afternoon, when he came back from another meeting with friends at the club, his mood had changed completely. He came home pale as a candle, nervous as a wet cat, smoking one cigarette after another and filling the house with smoke. Luck had turned again, and from the way he looked, it had turned ugly. "Damn loaded dice," he muttered, pacing back and forth in the living room like a caged animal. Damn moment I decided to double the bet. I tried not to pay attention, tried to pretend I wasn't listening, but my heart was already tight. I knew those signs. I knew that the next morning he'd come get me for the club, and this time it would be worse than normal. In the early morning hours of Sunday, he woke me for another trip to the club, but this time was different, completely different. He was drunker than normal, stumbling along the walls of the house, talking to himself as we walked through the empty streets of Millbrook. The smell of whiskey on him was so strong, it made me nauseous. "This time went too far," he murmured, stumbling on loose paving stones. "This time I got into something I don't know how I'll get out of. My God, how did I let it get to this point?" At the club, instead of taking me straight to the back like he always did, he wandered through the dark hallways, talking in desperate whispers with the fat man at the door, gesticulating a lot, his voice oscillating between pleading and desperation. I stood leaning against a damp wall that smelled of mold, waiting and pretending I wasn't paying attention, when I heard pieces of the conversation that made my blood run cold. "I don't have a way to pay that amount, Joe. Not even if I sold the house. The Colonel won't accept excuses. You know him. If I don't resolve this by Monday, he said he'll send his men. Could the girl cover this debt too?" The fat man looked in my direction with those small, piggy eyes, examined me from top to bottom as if evaluating cattle at market, and made a negative gesture with his head. "Otto, this time you went too far. Not even she can cover a debt that size. $5,000? That's money to buy a house. And the Colonel still wants interest on top. $5,000. The number echoed in my head like thunder. It was a fortune, more money than my family saw in years. How had my father managed to lose so much in one night? I stood there, leaning against the stinking wall of that cursed hallway, trying to understand what was happening. My father had gotten into a debt so big that not even selling me could he settle it? How was this possible? And what would happen to us if he couldn't pay? The rest of that early morning passed in a confused blur of voices, smoke, and fear. I vaguely remember the usual little room. I remember men coming and going more hurried than normal. I remember my father nervous at the door talking to other people, always gesticulating, always begging for more time. When we got back home, he was in total panic, sweating cold even in the Mississippi heat. On Sunday morning, my mother immediately noticed something was very wrong. My father couldn't stay still, paced around the house like a caged animal, talking to himself, drinking whiskey since he woke up, smoking cigarette after cigarette until the house was thick with smoke like fog. "Otto, for God's sake, what happened?" she asked with that weak voice, trying to hold his hands that trembled uncontrollably. "You're scaring me." But he just muttered that it was man's business and she shouldn't interfere, that women didn't understand business. My poor mother, already so fragile, got even more nervous and increased her dose of medicines, taking all 3 bottles at once to be able to bear the tense atmosphere in the house. It was in the late afternoon of Sunday that what changed everything forever happened. My father left the house saying he was going to resolve things once and for all, that he was going to settle everything with the Colonel. He came back after dinner completely drunk, more altered and desperate than I'd ever seen in my entire life. He came in stumbling over his own feet, knocked over a chair from the table, broke a plate that was in the sink, and shouted something about everything being lost that we couldn't understand. My mother, scared and trembling with fear, locked herself in the bedroom and took an extra dose of medicines to sleep. I stayed in the living room, watching my father collapse in an old armchair and start crying, something I'd never in my life seen him do. It was an ugly cry of a broken man, mixed with sobs and curse words. "It's all over," he repeated through tears. "It's all over. How am I going to tell her? How am I going to look her in the face?" After what seemed like an eternity, he got up staggering and said he was going to get cigarettes from the car. I heard the sound of the front door slamming, then a loud crash, as if he'd stumbled and fallen hard on the pavement. I got worried and went to see if he was okay. I found my father lying on the ground next to our old Blue Beetle, snoring loudly, completely passed out from drink and despair. Next to him, on the dusty ground, was a small black notebook that had fallen from his shirt pocket. I looked around with my heart pounding. The street was completely deserted. My mother was drugged by medicines and snoring loudly in the bedroom, my father unconscious on the ground. I picked up the notebook with trembling hands and went back inside the house, turning on the kitchen light. It was a simple little notebook, one of those from school that you bought for a few cents at the stationery store. But the pages were filled with my father's crooked, somewhat drunken handwriting. On the first page, written in blue pen, was Luckbook, Otto Carson, 1958. With my heart racing, I started leafing through slowly, and what I saw on the first pages made my blood freeze completely in my veins. Each page had meticulous notes about games, bets, dates, and lost amounts. But they weren't just cold numbers. In the column where it should say payment method, my father had written things that made me want to vomit right there on the kitchen table. March 15th, 1958. Ribeiro, lost $50 at poker. Payment, one night with Eliza first time. March 22nd, 1958. Dr. Carver, lost $75 at dice. Payment, Eliza until early morning. April 10th, 1958. Mitchell plus Professor Andrews, lost $100 at roulette. Payment, Eliza for both all night. April 18th, 1958. Mr. Johnson plus Dr. Carver, lost $80 at cards. Payment, Eliza for both, plus 2 extra hours. Page after page, the same horrendous thing. My father had turned my body into a macabre accounting, recording each humiliation I suffered as if it were just any business, as if I were cattle being traded at the farmer's market. 5 years of my life were there, summarized in numbers, dates, and transactions. My hands trembled so much, I almost dropped the notebook on the table. Tears started running down my face, dripping on the yellowed pages, but I kept reading as if hypnotized, as if I needed to see how far that documented monstrosity went. And then I got to the last pages, the most recent, with notes from last Friday, and saw something that made my whole world collapse like a house of cards. September 27th, 1963. Big game with Colonel Menezes. Bet all the money I won, plus the house deed, plus $2,000 promissory note. Lost everything in one hand. Right below, with a shakier handwriting that betrayed total despair, my father had written, total debt, $5,000 plus house deed plus 20% monthly interest equals $6,000 plus our house. And on the next line, the note that stopped my heart and made the world spin around me. Final agreement. With Colonel Menezes closed today, September 29th, 1963. Definitive delivery of Eliza as total payment of debt. She will live at Santa Rita Farm as special employee of the family. Move Monday, September 30th, 1963, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Below, almost illegible, he had scribbled, "Forgive me, my God, there was no other way." I read and reread those lines until I memorized every word, every comma, every period. Monday was exactly 12 hours away. In 12 hours, my father was going to hand me over to Colonel Menezes as if I were a pet, an object, his property. It wasn't for one night anymore. It wasn't temporary like it had always been. It was forever. Forever. He hadn't just sold my body for 5 years in the early mornings at the club. He had bet my entire life at a card table, and lost. Colonel Menezes had a terrible reputation throughout the region. He was a man of almost 60 years, widowed for more than 10, known for mistreating the employees on his farm. The stories that ran whispered through town about how he treated women who worked for him were too terrible to repeat out loud. They said whoever entered Santa Rita Farm to work for him was never seen in town again. They said he had a special room in the big house just for his special employees. They said things that kept any mother awake at night. And it was to him that my father was going to hand me over as a permanent slave, to save the deed to the house where my mother slept drugged, knowing nothing. I closed the notebook with violently trembling hands and sat there at the kitchen table, in the middle of the silent early morning, trying to process what I'd discovered. It wasn't just temporary abuse. It wasn't just a few bad years that would end one day when I turned 18 and could run away. My father had literally sold me as a slave to settle a gambling debt. In less than 12 hours, I would stop being Eliza May Carson of Millbrook to become the personal property of Colonel Menezes. I'd spend the rest of my life on an isolated farm in the middle of nowhere, being used however he wanted, never seeing my mother again, never setting foot in town again, never having hope of a different life. It was the absolute end. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape, no one to ask for help. In 12 hours, everything would be decided, and I would officially become a thing, not a person. But it was in that exact moment, holding that cursed notebook in my hands, feeling the weight of 5 years of humiliation summarized in those disgusting pages, that something was born in me that I'd never felt before in my life. A rage so big, so deep and so pure, that it burned inside my chest like a branding iron. If my life was going to end anyway, if I was going to be destroyed regardless, then at least I was going to drag down with me all those disgusting men who made me what they made me. If they were going to kill me inside, I was going to kill them outside, socially, morally, financially, in every way within my reach. I looked out the kitchen window and saw the day starting to dawn on the horizon. It was Sunday morning, and that afternoon there would be the monthly party of the social club board. An elegant party where all the important men of town would be present, along with their respectable wives, their good families, their children educated at the best schools. And that's when the plan was born in my head, clear and perfect as crystal water. If they wanted to use me as currency, I was going to use them as currency for revenge. If they thought they could break me in silence, I was going to break them in front of everyone. The notebook was there, in my hand. The proof of everything. And in a few hours, everyone was going to know who the respectable men of Millbrook really were. I spent that entire Sunday morning in a state of shock, walking through the house like a ghost, holding the cursed notebook against my chest. My mother, still drugged by medicines, barely left the bedroom. My father remained passed out on the ground next to the car, snoring under the strong Mississippi sun. It was as if the whole house had stopped in time, waiting for the apocalypse that would come the next morning. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I started getting ready. Not to run away, there was nowhere to go. Not to hide, it wouldn't do any good. I got ready for war. I took my prettiest dress, that light blue one my mother had sewn with so much care for my 16th birthday. I combed my long hair, leaving it loose over my shoulders. I put on the red lipstick I got from my aunt last Christmas and had never used. I wanted to be beautiful for my last day as Eliza May Carson. At 3 o'clock, when I heard the first chords from the country band that always played at the club board parties, I took the notebook and left the house. I didn't tell anyone, didn't leave a note. I just left, walking through the streets of Millbrook with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. The social club was in full party mode. Nice cars parked in front, men in white suits and women in elegant dresses climbing the main staircase, sounds of music and laughter coming through the open windows. It was the monthly board party, the most important social event in town, where the local elite gathered to show status and do business. I entered through the front door, something I'd never done in my life. I always entered through the back, like an animal being led to slaughter. This time I climbed the main staircase with my head held high, greeting the doorman who'd known me since I was little. The hall was packed. More than 200 people, all very well dressed, talking in small groups, drinking champagne and eating fancy appetizers. On stage, a 5-piece band played old tunes and songs, while some couples danced in the center of the hall. I walked slowly among the groups, looking for familiar faces, and they appeared one by one, like ghosts from my nightmare. There was Mr. Ribeiro, elegant in a gray suit, talking to his wife about the new pharmacy he was going to open. There was Dr. Carver, in an impeccable white jacket, laughing loudly in a circle of lawyers and farmers. Mr. Mitchell was near the bar, bragging about prosperous business at the market. Professor Andrews, always respected, was discussing education with other important families. And in the center of the hall, like a king on his throne, was Colonel Menezes. Surrounded by sycophants, telling stories about the farms, gesticulating with a glass of whiskey in his hand. When he saw me, he smiled and waved, as if he were an old family friend. My father was there too, obviously. He'd managed to pull himself together and make it to the party, probably hoping to get one more extension on the debt. He was in a corner, drinking beer and avoiding the Colonel's gaze, sweating cold even with the fan on. I took a deep breath, felt the weight of the notebook in my purse, and walked to the stage. The musicians were finishing a song when I got close. The vocalist, a young man I knew from church, greeted me. "Hi, Eliza. What a surprise to see you here at the party." "Hi, Johnny. Can I ask a favor? I need to say something important to everyone." "Can you lend me the microphone for a few minutes?" He looked kind of confused, but since he'd known me since childhood, and I'd always been a well-behaved girl, he handed over the microphone without questioning. "Everyone," I called, and my voice echoed through the hall's speakers. The conversations gradually decreased. Some people looked in my direction with curiosity. Others kept talking, thinking it was just another party announcement. "Excuse me, everyone," I repeated louder. "I'd like everyone's attention for a few minutes, please." Now the entire hall stopped. 200 people looking at me, waiting. I saw my father on the other side of the hall, his face turning white as paper when he realized where I was and what I had in my hand. "My name is Eliza May Carson," I began with a firm and clear voice. "Daughter of Mr. Otto Carson, that one over there in the corner. I'm 17 years old. I live on Magnolia Street, and I study at the elementary school here in town." Murmurs started spreading through the hall. People were wondering why a teenager was interrupting the elite's party. "I'm here today because tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock precisely, I'm going to be handed over as payment for a gambling debt. I'm going to spend the rest of my life on a farm, working as a slave, because my father lost our house at a card table." The silence now was absolute. Not even the sound of the fans could be heard. I saw several mouths opening in shock, several looks turning to my father, who was trying to hide behind a column. "But before I become the property of Colonel Menezes," I continued, looking directly at him, "I thought you should know how my father paid his debts for the last 5 years." I opened the notebook with trembling hands, but my voice remained firm. "I'm going to read you some excerpts from the notebook where my father recorded his business dealings. March 15th, 1958. "Stop that!" my father shouted from the other side of the hall, starting to push through people to get to the stage. But Dr. Ferreira and 2 other men held him by the arms. "Mr. Ribeiro from the pharmacy," I continued, looking directly at him. "Debt of $50 at poker. Payment, 1 night with Eliza. It was my first time. I was 12 years old." The scream that Mr. Ribeiro's wife let out echoed through the entire hall. She collapsed in a chair, feeling sick, while he turned red as a beet. March 22nd of the same year. Dr. Carver, our respected lawyer. Debt of $75 at Dice. Payment, Eliza until early morning. Mrs. Carmen, the doctor's wife, started crying loudly, screaming, "Lies! Lies!" But her husband's face had already confessed everything. April 10th, Mr. Mitchell from the market and Professor Andrews together. $100 at roulette. Payment, Eliza, for both all night. Confusion was taking over the hall. Women crying, men shouting, some trying to leave, others wanting to silence me. But I kept reading, page by page, date by date, name by name. June 3rd, Mr. Johnson from the county office and Dr. Carver again. August 15th, Colonel Sebastian, Mr. Roberts from the bakery and 2 more. December 20th, end-of-year party, 6 different men. Each name I spoke was a bomb exploding in the hall. Wives fainting, children asking their fathers what was happening, men trying to flee through the door. The mayor, who was also on the list, ran out with his family. The sheriff, whose name appeared several times, tried to pull me off the stage, but was stopped by other people who wanted to hear everything. "And to finish," I said, getting to the last page, "yesterday's agreement, September 29th, 1963. Total debt to Colonel Menezes, $6,000, plus the deed to our house. Payment, definitive delivery of Eliza as special employee of Santa Rita Farm, tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning." I looked directly at Colonel Menezes, who was pale as a ghost, surrounded by accusing stares. "In other words, everyone," I concluded, closing the notebook. "Tomorrow morning I stop being a person to become property. I thought your wives and children should know what kind of men you really are." I threw the notebook on the stage floor, where it made a dry sound that echoed through the silent hall. "You can keep it. It's proof of everything. 5 years of my life summarized in numbers and amounts. Now you know the price of the honor of Millbrook's most respected men." I walked down from the stage slowly, head held high, while total chaos took over the party. Women crying and screaming at their husbands, men trying to explain themselves, some fighting among themselves, others trying to escape. My father had disappeared in the confusion, probably fled through the back door. I walked to the main exit, where several people were still in shock, looking at me as if I were a ghost. At the door, I turned one last time to the hall in uproar and said loudly, "Enjoy the party." I left the club under the strong afternoon Mississippi sun, breathing free air for the first time in 5 years. I knew my life as I knew it was over, but now their lives were too. I walked home slowly, savoring each step in freedom. When tomorrow morning came, Colonel Menezes wouldn't want an employee who had publicly exposed all the powerful men in town. None of them would have the courage to lay a hand on me after that. I had transformed my shame into their condemnation. I had used the very weapon they used against me, public exposure, to free myself. And it worked. In the following days, the entire town talked about only one thing: the club scandal. Wives demanded separation, children cut ties with their fathers, businesses started failing. The police had to investigate, pressured by the offended families. My father, dishonored and with nowhere to run, left Millbrook and never came back. Colonel Menezes lost prestige and influence. The other men became social pariahs. And me? I moved to Jackson with my mother, who finally stopped taking medicines when she discovered the truth. Years later, I married a good man, had children, built a new life. But I never forgot the lesson I learned that Sunday in September in Millbrook. Sometimes, to free yourself from monsters, you have to become a monster too, at least for one day. And that's how, my dear ones, a 17-year-old girl who had spent 5 years being treated like a thing found the strength to turn the tables on those who thought they could destroy her life forever. Today, at 79 years young, when I wake up in the morning to tend my garden here in Jackson, I look at the plants growing and think about how life sometimes needs a storm to be able to bloom again. That's what happened to me that Sunday, in September 1963. I had to become a hurricane to be able to become spring again. You must be wondering, and after Mrs. Eliza, how did you manage to rebuild your life? Let me tell you quickly about the following years, because I know you're curious to know the end of the story. My mother, poor thing, when she found out everything that had happened during those 5 years, was so shaken she spent 3 days just crying. But you know what was interesting? She stopped taking those strong medicines from one moment to the next. It was as if discovering the truth had cured her nerves. The problem wasn't nerves. It was living in a house full of secrets and lies. We moved to Jackson 2 weeks after the scandal. We went to live in a simple little house that my Aunt Joanna got for us, very close to downtown. My mother got work sewing from home, and I started working at a fabric store in the city center. It was honest work, where I received my little paycheck at the end of the month and nobody could touch me without my permission. It took me 2 years to be able to trust men again. When Mr. George, who worked at the store next door, started paying attention to me, I was terrified, thinking he wanted something in return. But he was patient, respectful, courted me the old-fashioned way, asking permission to talk to me, to take me to the movies, to hold my hand. We dated for 3 years before getting married. On our wedding day in 1969, I cried so much I smeared all my makeup. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for having discovered that there was real love in the world. Love that doesn't hurt. Love that doesn't humiliate. Love that builds instead of destroys. I had 3 children with my George, 2 boys and a girl. I raised them with lots of affection, but also with lots of conversation about respect, about boundaries, about the difference between true affection and touch that hurts. My daughter, especially, I always spoke clearly. Sweetheart, your body is your temple. No one has the right to enter that temple without your permission, no matter who they are. My George was a good man, hard-working, who respected me and respected our children. We lived 42 years together until God took him in 2011. They were years of peace, of true love, of a united family. They proved to me that it was possible to build a beautiful life after so much destruction. My mother lived to be 85 years old. She died in her sleep, peacefully, in our house in Jackson. In her last years, we talked a lot about that terrible time in Millbrook. She always asked for forgiveness for not having noticed sooner, for not having protected me. But I always said, Mama, you were also a victim. You were also being destroyed by that man. About my father, I heard from others that he ended up in New York City, where he died alone a few years later, drinking on the streets. I didn't feel anger when I found out. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything. It was as if he'd become a stranger to me the moment I read that cursed notebook. And the other men? Well, life took care of bringing justice to each one. Mr. Ribeiro lost the pharmacy because nobody wanted to buy medicine from him anymore. Dr. Carver had to leave town because families didn't want a lawyer who did those things with children. Professor Andrews was fired from school. Colonel Menezes lost political prestige and died bitter years later. The entire town changed after that Sunday. Mothers became more attentive to their children, wives started questioning their husbands more, and everyone learned that an appearance of respectability means nothing if underneath there's rot. But the most important lesson I want to leave with you, especially for the girls and women who are listening to me, is this. No matter how much they've tried to break you, no matter how much you think you're destroyed, there's always a strength inside us that nobody can take away. That strength was sleeping inside me for 5 years, but when it woke up, it was powerful enough to turn an entire town upside down. And if it was in me, who was just a 17-year-old girl without education and without money, it's also in each of you. If you're going through something similar to what I went through, if someone is hurting you, if someone is using your body to pay for something that's not your responsibility, if someone is threatening your family to keep you silent, I want you to know one thing: it's not your fault. It never was, it never will be. And as impossible as it may seem to escape, as much as you think you have nowhere to run, there's always a way out. It may not be easy, it may be scary like it was for me, but it exists. Seek help. Talk to someone you trust. Report it. Scream if you need to. Don't carry this alone like I carried it for so long. Today there are laws that protect children and women. Today there are specialized agencies, hotline numbers, people trained to help. Use these weapons that didn't exist in my time. And for you who are parents, talk to your children. Teach about respect, about boundaries, about the difference between affection and abuse. Create an environment where they feel safe to tell you anything that's happening. My story ended well because I found the courage to react even when I thought I had nothing left to lose. But it could have ended very differently if I had found responsible adults who protected me from the beginning. You who are watching me now can be those adults for some child or teenager who needs help. Stay alert to the signs. Believe when someone tells you they're being hurt. Protect those who can't protect themselves. And to finish, I want to thank from the bottom of my old heart each of you who had the patience to listen to this difficult story from a 79-year-old grandma. I know it wasn't easy to hear, just as it wasn't easy for me to tell. But if this story can save one child, if it can give strength to someone going through something similar, if it can open an adult's eyes to better protect the little ones, then it was worth reliving each painful moment. Don't forget to leave that special like down there to help this grandma spread this message. Comment telling where you're from, if the story touched your heart, and especially, if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. Life is beautiful, my dear ones. Even after the most terrible storm, a rainbow is always born. I'm living proof that it's possible to start over, it's possible to be happy, it's possible to transform pain into strength. A kiss in each of your hearts. May God bless you all, and see you in the next video.